What happened when old Hollywood mixed aliens, forbidden fantasies, wild costumes, and almost no limits? Long before modern sci-fi became polished and predictable, filmmakers were already making space movies that left audiences shocked, confused, and sometimes furious. Some were campy, some were disturbing, and others pushed adult themes further than anyone expected. If you enjoy forgotten movies Hollywood would rather leave buried, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Number 20. Devil Girl from Mars, 1954. Long before space villains became giant computer-generated monsters, one of cinema's strangest invaders arrived wearing black leather and looking completely unimpressed with Earth. Devil Girl from Mars sends the commanding Naya from Mars to a remote Scottish inn after her spacecraft runs into trouble. Her mission immediately makes the movie unusual. Mars has a shortage of men, so Naya intends to take suitable Earth males back with her. Instead of presenting extraterrestrials as monstrous creatures, the filmmakers made their Martian visitor glamorous, dominant, intelligent, and intimidating. One of the movie's most remembered sights is Naya entering the inn alongside Chani, her towering robot. She barely needs to raise her voice because her cold confidence does most of the work. By 1954 standards, the combination of alien invasion, reversed gender roles, tight futuristic clothing, and Naya's blunt purpose gave the picture a surprisingly provocative edge. Today it looks wonderfully theatrical, but at the time its basic premise alone was daring. Number 19. Queen of Outer Space, 1958. Imagine American astronauts reaching Venus and discovering that men have practically disappeared from power. That is the colorful setup of Queen of Outer Space, a film that turned the usual 1950s space adventure formula upside down. After their spacecraft lands on Venus, the astronauts encounter a civilization ruled almost entirely by women. Queen Yelena controls the planet and distrusts men, while scientist Talea, played by Zsa Zsa Gabor, represents a more rebellious side of Venusian society. The famous visual attraction was obvious: elaborate gowns, unusually revealing futuristic costumes, bright colors, and a planet designed more like a glamorous nightclub than a scientific prediction of Venus. Beneath the campiness, however, the story plays with gender politics that were unusual for mainstream American science fiction of the period. Earthmen suddenly become outsiders surrounded by women who control the military, government, and technology. It was cheesecake science fiction, certainly, but it was also considerably stranger than the innocent space adventures audiences were accustomed to seeing. And if these first two already seem unusual, make sure you're subscribed, because the movies ahead make 1950s Venus look almost respectable. Tell us in the comments which forgotten alien movie deserves a modern remake. Number 18. Nude on the Moon, 1961. At first, this looks like another cheap story about scientists chasing the dream of space travel. Then the astronauts actually reach the moon, and the movie becomes something very different. Nude on the Moon follows two researchers whose expedition discovers vegetation, breathable conditions, and a hidden lunar civilization populated by beautiful inhabitants. Scientific realism leaves the building almost immediately. The movie's signature sequence comes when the explorers wander through this supposedly secret lunar paradise and observe its residents. Rather than frightening monsters, the inhabitants were presented as part of the film's nudist movie attraction. That made the production particularly unusual in 1961. Director Doris Wishman was working in the so-called nudie-cutie market, where thin storylines were often constructed around material mainstream theaters generally avoided. Its combination of rockets, moon exploration, fantasy civilization, and adult-oriented spectacle makes Nude on the Moon one of the earliest examples of exploitation cinema, realizing that science fiction could provide an excuse for practically anything. Number 17. Mars Needs Women, 1967. Few movie titles explain their entire plot as efficiently as this one. Mars has a population crisis, and 5 Martian men are sent to Earth looking for women who can help save their civilization. Their targets are selected carefully, including Dr. Marjorie Bolan, a brilliant scientist played by Yvonne Craig. Martian leader Dopp eventually becomes emotionally attached to her, complicating what began as a cold mission. The most memorable material is not a giant battle, but the strange process of Martians blending into ordinary American society. They steal clothing, study humans, attend public events, and attempt to pass unnoticed while searching for candidates. Director Larry Buchanan made the film extremely cheaply, yet its concept gave it lasting exploitation appeal. The title promised something scandalous, even though the finished movie remained much tamer than that advertising suggested. Still, the central idea of extraterrestrial visitors arriving specifically because their planet needs Earth women, ensured that Mars needs women, became one of the era's most notorious examples of suggestive low-budget science fiction. Number 16. Queen of Blood, 1966. Something is floating through space, and rescuing it turns out to be a terrible mistake. Queen of Blood begins when Earth receives evidence of an extraterrestrial spacecraft and sends astronauts to investigate. They recover a mysterious green-skinned alien woman from the wreckage. At first, she appears silent, fragile, and strangely hypnotic. Once the return journey begins, however, crew members discover that their passenger survives by feeding on blood. One especially memorable sequence involves an astronaut approaching the alien while she watches him with an expression that is almost romantic. The moment quickly changes from attraction to danger, making seduction itself part of the horror. Florence Marley's performance is crucial because she hardly needs dialogue. Her stare, movements, and appearance give the alien queen an unsettling combination of beauty and threat. Released years before Alien, the movie was already connecting extraterrestrial life with body horror and dangerous attraction. Its effects were modest, but the imagery remains remarkably eerie for a low-budget 1966 production. Number 15. Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women, 1968. This bizarre production started with Soviet science fiction footage, and then became something only American exploitation cinema could have created. Producer Roger Corman repurposed material from Planeta Burr, while Peter Bogdanovich directed new scenes involving a mysterious civilization of Venusian women. The astronauts explore Venus, battling prehistoric creatures, dangerous terrain, and volcanic activity. Unknown to them, a group of telepathic women observes events from a distance. A famous sequence shows the Venusians gathered near the sea in matching outfits, communicating mentally and reacting angrily after the astronauts destroy a flying creature they worship. Mamie Van Doren became the movie's most recognizable attraction, even though the newly filmed Venusian material barely interacts directly with the original Soviet footage. That disconnect is part of the film's charm. It feels like two entirely different movies have collided, one a serious space expedition, the other a dreamy drive-in fantasy. Corman wanted additional commercial appeal, and the added Venusian women gave him exactly that, producing one of the strangest cultural combinations in 1960s science fiction. Number 14. Space Thing, 1968. Few low-budget productions abandon scientific seriousness faster than Space Thing. The movie takes familiar spacecraft imagery and uses it as a framework for an adult-oriented parody that barely pretends to care about realistic space exploration. Its story involves a character entering an interplanetary adventure where disguise, rival civilizations, and a spacecraft crew create a series of increasingly suggestive situations. What people remember most is the ship itself. Instead of disciplined astronauts performing technical duties, the crew exists inside a deliberately exaggerated fantasy version of space travel. The production belongs to the period when adult filmmakers were beginning to borrow recognizable genres because adding detectives, spies, monsters, or aliens gave simple exploitation stories a marketable gimmick. Space Thing was particularly shameless about the strategy. Rockets and futuristic costumes were not there to explore humanity's destiny among the stars. They were there because adult movie in outer space sounded more unusual than another contemporary bedroom comedy. That ridiculous confidence is exactly why the movie survives as a curiosity today. Number 13. Zeta 1, 1970. Secret agents, alien women, psychedelic sets, strip poker, and a bizarre interdimensional society somehow ended up in the same movie. Also released under names including The Love Factor and Alien Women, Zeta 1 feels like someone mixed a Bond parody with a comic book nobody was supposed to read at work. The story follows Agent James Word as he investigates women connected to Angvia, a strange female society led by Zeta. Their methods include recruiting women from Earth, while government figures attempt to discover who these mysterious visitors really are. One of the film's defining features is its visual design. Costumes are minimal, colors are loud, and many sequences seem designed around spectacle rather than logic. What makes it historically interesting is how openly it combines science fiction with sexploitation. British genre cinema had flirted with suggestive futuristic imagery before, but Zeta 1 practically builds an entire alien civilization around it. Critics were not especially kind. Yet its psychedelic weirdness has made it far harder to forget than many more respectable productions. Number 12. 2069. A Sex Odyssey. 1974. The title alone tells you exactly which famous science fiction classic this German production wanted audiences to remember. But its mission into space is considerably less philosophical. A group of women from Venus travels to Earth because their society faces a reproductive problem. Their search eventually brings them to a Bavarian village, where they begin studying the local population. Rather than enormous futuristic sets, much of the comedy comes from placing supposed extraterrestrial visitors in ordinary rural surroundings. The contrast makes the movie feel less like a space epic and more like a mischievous European comedy wearing a science fiction helmet. Its best-known sequences involve the Venusian travelers attempting to complete their mission while misunderstanding Earth customs. The movie received adult-oriented distribution and became part of the growing wave of 1970s science fiction exploitation that openly borrowed recognizable titles and imagery from respectable genre hits. Kubrick had sent audiences toward Jupiter searching for humanity's future. This production looked at that achievement and apparently decided Venusian visitors exploring Bavaria sounded more profitable. Number 11. The Haidan of Maukbiangjiao, 1973. Here is where the countdown gets seriously obscure. Later reissued under the much easier title Invasion of the Girl Snatchers, this 1973 exploitation oddity combines criminal schemes, alien replacement, bizarre comedy, and counterculture filmmaking. An investigation into a kidnapping operation eventually reveals that something much stranger is happening. Humanoid extraterrestrials are replacing people with alien copies, turning a crime story into a chaotic body-snatching plot. One of its strangest ideas involves replacement humans attempting to understand their new identities after the transformation. Instead of presenting alien duplication with the solemn paranoia of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, this movie throws the concept into an intentionally messy underground comedy. The production looks cheap because it was cheap, but the lack of polish makes it resemble a lost midnight movie discovered in someone's garage. Its later Girl Snatchers title emphasized the exploitation angle much more aggressively than the original name. This certainly is not elegant science fiction, but elegance was never the mission. Confusion, provocation, and sheer weirdness were enough. Number 10. The Girl from Starship Venus, 1975. What if an alien came to Earth not to conquer us, but simply to study the one subject polite science fiction movies kept avoiding? That is essentially the joke behind The Girl from Starship Venus, also known as the Sexplorer. A Venusian visitor takes human female form and lands in London. Her assignment is to research human behavior, but she quickly discovers that understanding Earth relationships is much more complicated than reading a scientific report. The Soho setting becomes important because the alien wanders through a part of London already associated with nightlife and adult entertainment. Instead of ray guns and invading armies, her journey becomes a series of encounters designed around her complete unfamiliarity with human customs. One of the film's most remembered running jokes involves the visitor treating intimate behavior as though she were an anthropologist, carefully documenting a newly discovered species. The production was made in the middle of Britain's 1970s sex comedy boom, but the extraterrestrial gimmick separates it from dozens of similar films. There was even a more explicit version prepared for some overseas markets, demonstrating how aggressively producers were willing to adapt the same basic film for different audiences. It may be silly, but its concept represents adult alien cinema in almost pure form. An extraterrestrial literally arrives on Earth to investigate why humans behave the way they do. Number 9. Star Babe, 1977. Sometimes subtlety simply leaves the building, catches a rocket, and never comes back. Star Babe is exactly that kind of production. The setup sends a group called the Star Angels toward a distant planet as part of an effort to prevent a threat against Earth. From there, science fiction adventure becomes little more than a framework for adult parody. Everything is exaggerated. The names, costumes, planetary concepts, and situations seem designed to make traditional space opera look ridiculous. The memorable material comes from the collision between heroic sci-fi language and a movie that clearly has no intention of behaving like Star Wars or 2001. Characters speak as if enormous interplanetary events are taking place, while the production values constantly remind you that this is exploitation cinema working with limited resources. Released in 1977, the film arrived during the year Star Wars changed science fiction forever. That timing makes Star Babe even more fascinating as a cultural artifact. Hollywood was beginning to turn outer space into huge family blockbusters. At almost exactly the same moment, adult filmmakers were looking at the same stars and creating a completely different cinematic universe, one designed for midnight theaters instead of shopping mall multiplexes. Number 8. Invasion of the Love Drones, 1977. Even among obscure adult science fiction films, this one manages to sound like something invented during a particularly strange fever dream. Invasion of the Love Drones takes the familiar idea of an extraterrestrial threat and converts it into deliberately provocative satire. Earth faces unusual alien visitors whose appearance and behavior have almost nothing in common with the cold, mechanical invaders of traditional 1950s science fiction. The heroes discover that defeating the extraterrestrials requires an equally unconventional strategy. Rather than relying entirely on military hardware or brilliant scientists, the story turns its adult premise into the central weapon against invasion. Visually, the aliens became memorable for their exaggerated clothing, hairstyles, and sunglasses. There is no attempt to make them believable. They look absurd, because absurdity is the point. By this stage of the 1970s, adult cinema had learned that parodying science fiction gave filmmakers permission to make every element bigger and stranger. No one expected convincing astrophysics from a movie called Invasion of the Love Drones. What makes it historically notable is just how completely it takes a serious genre, the alien invasion thriller, and rewrites its rules for an entirely different audience. It is less interested in whether humanity survives than in seeing how many taboos can be turned into jokes before the final reel. Number 7. Star Virgin, 1979. By 1979, the innocent alien visitor had become an established adult film character. Arrive on Earth, misunderstand human relationships, and begin an extremely unconventional education. Star Virgin embraces that formula without hesitation. Its extraterrestrial heroine wants to understand a mysterious Earth activity that everyone around her seems to know more about than she does. That already familiar setup becomes much stranger when the story unexpectedly throws other fantasy elements into the mix. Even Dracula somehow enters the picture, creating a combination of science fiction and gothic parody that sounds impossible, until you remember what late 1970s exploitation cinema was capable of doing. The memorable scenes are not built around expensive effects. They rely on the heroine encountering increasingly ridiculous characters while maintaining the basic visitor studying Earth premise. There is something almost charming about how little concern the filmmakers show for genre boundaries. Aliens, adult comedy, horror references, and parody can all exist together because consistency clearly was not the priority. The movie appeared during the same year that Alien transformed extraterrestrial horror at the mainstream level. Yet in another corner of cinema, filmmakers were still using extraterrestrials for something far less frightening and considerably more mischievous. That contrast makes 1979 one of the strangest years in the entire history of alien movies. Number 6. Spaced Out/Outer Touch, 1979. 3 female aliens crash land in England, accidentally capture 4 humans, and discover that some of their prisoners belong to a gender they barely understand. What follows is less close encounters and more intergalactic culture shock. Originally released as Outer Touch, and later reworked for American audiences as Spaced Out, Norman J. Warren's movie deliberately combines low-budget science fiction with British adult comedy. The captives find themselves aboard a spacecraft controlled partly by a bizarre computer system. Instead of being interrogated for military information, they become participants in the aliens' confused attempts to understand human anatomy, attraction, and relationships. One of the funniest recurring elements is the aliens treating completely ordinary human differences as astonishing scientific discoveries. The joke reverses the typical invasion story. Humans are no longer studying extraterrestrials are studying us. The spacecraft looks cheap, the effects are deliberately silly, and the costumes tell you immediately that scientific realism was never the plan. Contemporary criticism recognized exactly what the movie was attempting, a combination of science fiction parody and adult farce, and the later American version leaned even further into broad humor. It is trashy, ridiculous, and impossible to confuse with serious filmmaking, but it also represents the final stage of a trend that began decades earlier with Venusian queens and Martian visitors. Number 5. The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. Not every adult alien movie was cheap exploitation. Some were strange, beautiful, serious works made by major filmmakers, and Nicolas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth may be the clearest example. David Bowie plays Thomas Jerome Newton, an extraterrestrial who arrives on Earth, searching for a way to save his drought-stricken home planet. Using advanced knowledge, he creates a powerful technology company and begins accumulating the money necessary to build a spacecraft. Then Earth starts changing him. Alcohol, television, wealth, loneliness, government surveillance, and human relationships slowly derail Newton's mission. Instead of conquering humanity, the alien is essentially conquered by human excess. One famous scene reveals Newton's true extraterrestrial appearance to Mary Lou. The transformation is unsettling because the audience has spent so long accepting Bowie's fragile human disguise that seeing what exists underneath suddenly destroys the illusion. The film also contained unusually strong mature material for mainstream science fiction. The BFC has specifically classified versions for strong intimate content and nudity, while BFI retrospectives continue to emphasize the film's themes of decadence and alienation. What makes it provocative is not simply what appears on screen. It treats sexuality, addiction, capitalism, and identity as pieces of the same alien experience. Rather than showing an extraterrestrial learning why humanity is wonderful, it asks whether prolonged exposure to humanity might actually ruin him. That distinction matters. Exploitation filmmakers used aliens to escape the rules of polite cinema, but filmmakers like Nicholas Roeg used them to examine the rules themselves. An extraterrestrial character can observe humanity without sharing our assumptions. Why do people chase money? Why do they become addicted to entertainment? Why do relationships become destructive? Why does technological progress fail to make people happier? Newton is fascinating precisely because he begins as an outsider who seems almost immune to these weaknesses. Watching them gradually consume him turns the film into something darker than a conventional invasion story. Earth does not need soldiers to defeat its visitor. Earth simply offers him everything. This is where mature science fiction becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Adult content is not present merely to attract attention. It becomes part of the argument. Human desire itself is the dangerous force. That idea would become increasingly common as 1970s science fiction grew more pessimistic, leading directly to another film where the threat does not merely attack the human body, it quietly replaces it. Number 4. Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1978. The scariest alien may be the one who looks exactly like the person sitting beside you. Philip Kaufman's 1978 remake moves the classic invasion story into San Francisco, where strange plants begin producing duplicates of ordinary people. Donald Sutherland plays Health Inspector Matthew Bennell, who slowly realizes that friends, partners, and strangers are being replaced while they sleep. The copies look human and remember human lives, but emotion has disappeared. One unforgettable sequence shows a partially formed duplicate with disturbingly unfinished human features, turning the process of replacement into genuine body horror. Then there is the ending. Matthew appears normal until he sees Veronica Cartwright's character. He suddenly points toward her and releases the horrifying alien signal. The realization hits immediately. The hero we trusted is gone. The film's adult quality comes less from sexuality than its disturbing physical imagery, bleakness, and overwhelming paranoia. BBFC Guidance notes its strong violence, horror, and some nudity, while BFI Writing has highlighted how each adaptation reflects the fears of its era. In the 1950s, body snatchers represented conformity and Cold War anxiety. By 1978, the same concept felt perfect for a society worried about urban isolation and losing personal identity. Instead of destroying cities, these aliens erase the messy emotions that make people human. That idea remains far more disturbing than another flying saucer shooting lasers. Alien movies had now traveled an enormous distance from the glamorous invaders of the 1950s. Naya walked into a Scottish inn, announcing exactly what she wanted. The pod people of 1978 barely announced themselves at all. That change reflects the fears of the era. By the late 1970s, distrust of institutions, corporations, government, technology, and even neighbors had become powerful material for filmmakers. The extraterrestrial was no longer necessarily something arriving in a shiny spacecraft. It might already be inside your city, your workplace, or your home. Adult science fiction benefited enormously from that psychological shift because filmmakers could explore topics that once belonged mainly to serious drama. Relationships could collapse. Heroes could fail. Sexuality could become uncomfortable rather than romantic. Bodies could become frightening. Endings did not need to reassure anyone, and yet one of the most famous provocative space movies of the entire era had taken almost the opposite path 10 years earlier, presenting the universe as colorful, playful, glamorous, and completely unconcerned with traditional ideas of good taste. Number 3. Barbarella, 1968. Few opening scenes announced a movie's intentions faster than the beginning of Barbarella. Jane Fonda floats through her spacecraft in zero gravity, removing pieces of a space outfit, while the credits appear around her. For 1968 mainstream cinema, that was an extraordinary introduction. The story sends Barbarella across the galaxy to locate scientist Durand Durand, whose powerful weapon threatens a supposedly peaceful future. Her journey brings her into contact with strange civilizations, dangerous machines, bizarre creatures, and characters who seem to belong inside psychedelic album artwork. One of the film's most notorious sequences involves Durand Durand placing Barbarella inside his excessive machine, a futuristic device intended to overwhelm her through pleasure. Instead of defeating her, the machine itself eventually fails. The scene became symbolic of the entire movie. Sexuality transformed into absurd science fiction technology. Roger Vadim directs the film less like a realistic space adventure and more like a moving pop art fantasy. Costumes change constantly, sets look intentionally artificial, and Jane Fonda's character moves through everything with cheerful curiosity. TCM has described Barbarella as radical for its time, while its provocative visual style became inseparable from Fonda's image during that period. It may seem playful compared with later adult cinema, but this was a major international production, openly placing sensuality at the center of a futuristic adventure. That helped turn Barbarella into a cult icon and opened the door for far cheaper filmmakers to imitate what it had done. The impact of Barbarella is difficult to separate from the explosion of science fiction exploitation that followed it. The movie proved futuristic eroticism did not have to remain hidden inside tiny independent theaters. A recognizable Hollywood star could appear in a lavish production built around imagery that would have been difficult to imagine only a decade earlier. But success created imitation. Producers saw spaceships, outrageous clothing, psychedelic landscapes, and suggestive machines, and realized they could reproduce the basic formula without reproducing the budget. The result was an entire shadow universe of cheaper science fiction pictures. Some copied the visual language, others copied only the provocative attitude, and a few decided even Barbarella had not gone far enough. By the middle of the 1970s, the difference between parody and adult cinema could become almost meaningless. That is where our final two movies appear, one transforming the alien into pure nightmare, the other transforming one of science fiction's most innocent heroes into one of cinema's most notorious spoofs. Number 2. Alien, 1979. Nothing in mainstream science fiction prepared audiences for the moment that creature appeared at the dinner table. Ridley Scott's Alien begins like a working-class space drama. The crew of the commercial ship Nostromo wakes from suspended animation, investigates a mysterious transmission, and discovers an enormous abandoned spacecraft containing strange eggs. When Kane approaches one, a creature attaches itself to him. After seeming to recover, he joins the crew for a meal. Suddenly he begins convulsing, and a small alien creature violently emerges from his body before disappearing into the ship. That sequence became one of the most famous shock moments in film history. But Alien crosses boundaries in subtler ways too. H.R. Geiger's creature design mixes mechanical and biological imagery into something intentionally uncomfortable. The alien's life cycle turns reproduction itself into horror, while the cramped Nostromo transforms outer space into a haunted house from which nobody can escape. Sigourney Weaver's Ripley gradually becomes the film's central survivor, especially after most of the crew disappears. The BPLFC still describes the movie in terms of intense threat, dark tone, injury detail, and strong language. At the time, this was not the clean space fantasy audiences had recently embraced through Star Wars. Space was filthy, industrial, frightening, and filled with a creature whose biology seemed designed specifically to violate the human body. Released in 1979, Alien effectively closed the decade by proving that adult extraterrestrial cinema could become sophisticated, critically respected, and terrifying without losing any of its provocative power. By this point, alien cinema had split into nearly every direction imaginable. Extraterrestrials could represent desire, fear, liberation, conformity, consumerism, gender politics, or biological nightmare. No other genre offered filmmakers quite the same freedom because an alien, by definition, did not have to obey human rules. That freedom is what connects a masterpiece like Alien with the cheapest movie on this list. Their artistic goals could not be more different, but both ask audiences to imagine bodies, societies, and behaviors outside ordinary experience. The difference is execution. Ridley Scott used extraordinary production design and suspense to create terror. Exploitation filmmakers used parody and shock value to attract attention, and one production in particular managed to combine crude adult humor with stop-motion monsters, elaborate effects, spaceships, elaborate costumes, and a recognizable parody of one of the oldest heroes in science fiction. It was so notorious that censorship became part of its history. Number 1. Flesh Gordon, 1974. If Barbarella opened the door, Flesh Gordon kicked it off the hinges and launched the pieces into orbit. The 1974 film takes the classic Flash Gordon adventure formula and rebuilds it as an unapologetically adult space parody. Earth is being affected by a bizarre ray controlled by Emperor Wang, ruler of a distant world, and hero Flesh Gordon must travel through space to stop him. That simple setup allows the movie to parody practically everything associated with old serial adventures. Ridiculous spacecraft, evil emperors, helpless planets, strange monsters, heroic costumes, and melodramatic dialogue. What surprised many viewers was the amount of genuine craft buried underneath the outrageous material. The production employed effects artists, including Rick Baker, and its stop-motion sequences were far more ambitious than anyone might expect from this kind of movie. One of the most famous spectacles involves a giant stop-motion creature during the climactic adventure. Instead of merely functioning as background comedy, the animation gives the sequence the texture of an actual fantasy film. Behind the scenes, the movie also developed a complicated censorship history. The Beef left C records multiple cut versions, while contemporary accounts describe footage being altered as distributors attempted to move the picture between adult and more commercially accessible classifications. That makes Flesh Gordon more than another cheap parody. It represents the moment when adult exploitation cinema became ambitious enough to imitate a full-scale science fiction adventure rather than merely borrowing a spaceship set for a few scenes. It was vulgar, ridiculous, technically inventive, commercially calculated, and absolutely impossible to imagine coming from a major studio of its era. That is exactly why it takes the number 1 spot. Before the 1980s arrived, alien cinema had officially crossed almost every line available. So which of these forbidden space oddities surprised you the most? Some became cult classics, others nearly disappeared, but all proved that filmmakers were testing boundaries long before modern cinema arrived. If you enjoyed discovering this strange side of science fiction history, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And tell us below which forgotten alien movie we should explore next, because the vault of outrageous old sci-fi is far from empty.